This question is what we call a flawed method of reasoning question. Let's read the question stem together. It says the reasoning in the consumer's argument, so it's this stuff. This question will always say the reasoning, the stimulus, and the argument above, whatever, is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that the argument does something bad. So we have to describe what the argument is doing. It's a very high level question. In our full course, we talk about sort of the progression of LR questions. This is very high level. We're getting to the level of not just, say question one was a labeling question. We try to figure out what the conclusion is. You just like, oh, this thing right here, that's the conclusion. You just slap a conclusion label on it. And then we have questions that you try to engage with the argument, make the argument stronger, weaker. Here we're just trying to describe what the argument has done incorrectly, right? And as a result of that, yes, we do end up weakening it, but we're not directly weakening it. The analogy I like to use is the difference between weakening and a flawed method of reasoning is weakening questions request you to just attack the argument, whereas flawed method reasoning requests you to say how you're going to attack the argument, describe where the argument is vulnerable to being attacked. All right, so we have to read the stimulus and figure out the argument. The latest Connerly report suggests that Ogssenfrey's prepackaged meals are virtually devoid of nutritional values. Now, don't get confused by this. We got a report that says this company, O company, their prepackaged meals have no value. Okay, but so the consumer renders this to context and starts this argument here, and this is a lesson we learn in our grammar lessons. But the Connerly report is commissioned by Danto Foods. And who's Danto Foods? Danto Foods is called embedded modifier here. Danto Foods is Ogssenfrey's largest corporate rival. So now we read it again without this. The Connerly report is commissioned by Danto Foods, and early drafts of the report are submitted for approval to Danto Foods' PR department. So you see, it's introducing this is introducing a little bit of a bias here, right? I mean, if I'm Danto Foods and I'm paying for this report, then I want the results to be bad. I want the results on my rival company's food to say, yeah, it's bad, no nutritional value. And because of the obvious bias of the report, it's clear that Ogssenfrey prepackaged meals are what? Are really nutritious? No, that's not right. See, just because there's bias doesn't mean that it's nutritious. Of course, I want the report to come out with results saying that they're not nutritious. But just because I want it that way and the report came out that way doesn't mean that it couldn't have been that their prepackaged meals are actually completely devoid of nutritional value. You see, I mean, think about it this way. If you really were the, say, chief public relations officer at Danto Foods, and you commission this report, this will be a really stupid way to go about it. You wouldn't do it. You get fired for this, right? If you say like you pick their prepackaged, fresh cut fruits, which actually has a lot of nutritional value, which actually is very nutritious, and then you just say to the Connerly commission that you put together, and you say just whatever, just make stuff up, come up with stuff that says it's totally devoid of nutritional value. If you did that and it's just factually inaccurate, somebody's going to find out, like this consumer, right? And you're going to get in trouble for that. So, what'd you do? What you would rather do is that you probably just actually go to Ogssenfrey's product line. You pick stuff that actually is devoid of nutritional value. Then you commission a report on that, in which case your report will report that it is devoid of nutritional value and it will be actually factually accurate. So you see, that's sort of why this argument just doesn't make any sense. Just because I'm biased, all that means is all you can conclude from this is that it is clear that this report is owed some skepticism, right? It is clear that we ought to be skeptical with regard to the conclusions that this report presents. You can't just go ahead and say that therefore Ogssenfrey's prepackaged meals are actually nutritional. We have no idea on whether it is nutritional or not. We just have now reason to believe that one report which attempts to tell us whether it's nutritional, this report we have reason to be skeptical about because of all this stuff. That's where this argument is bad. So let's see which answer choice describes that argument, describes this flaw, this weakness. A says the argument treats evidence that there is an apparent bias as evidence that the report's claims are false. That's exactly right. The evidence here, the premise is that there's apparent bias. Yup, check. Where's that? That's right over here. Right, Ogssenfrey is Danto's largest corporate rival, and the report had to be cleared through through Danto's public relations department. So that's evidence, that's premise that there's apparent bias. But we treat this premise that there's apparent bias as if it were a premise that said the report's claims are false. That you see, what does that mean? This is called referential phrasing, which is something else one of our lessons teaches you. What are the claims? The claim is that they're devoid of nutritional value, and we're treating it as if it's false. See, really are nutritious. treating it as if it were a false claim. That's what makes A a very, very good answer choice. It's the correct answer choice. B says it draws a conclusion based solely on unrepresented sample of Ogsonfrey's products. We don't know that. You see, we'd have to presume. We have no idea. Right? It suggests that prepackaged meals. Maybe that's all Ogsonfrey makes is prepackaged meals. They don't make anything else. So this could be a totally representative sample. So we don't know. Sure, it's possible that, that's what this argument did, but just given what we have here on paper, we can't say that the argument did this. C says fails to take into account the possibility that Ogsonfrey has just as much motivation to create negative publicity for Danto as Danto has to create negative publicity for Ogsonfrey. Yeah, that's right. This is descriptively accurate. The argument has failed to take into account the possibility that Ogsonfrey would smear campaign Danto just as Danto is smear campaigning Ogsonfrey. But so what? That's not a flaw of this argument. That's not why this premise doesn't support this conclusion. That has nothing to do with why this premise doesn't support this conclusion. Who cares what Ogsonfrey's smear campaign is trying to do? You see, it has no bearing on why this premise doesn't support this conclusion. A has bearing on why this premise doesn't support the conclusion. See, you can think of another way. The argument fails to take into account that cats like to drink milk and dogs like to play catch. Yes, also correct. Very accurately describes the argument. Argument didn't say anything about cats, didn't say anything about dogs, but that has nothing to do with why this premise doesn't support the conclusion. You see, so think about it that way, and I hope you can see sort of how clearly bad C is. C is just trying to get you to play the same game that the author is playing. D says, fails to provide evidence that Danto Foods packages are not more nutritious. Yes, this is also descriptively accurate. Our argument failed to provide evidence that Danto food is actually more nutritious. But so what? We don't need to provide that evidence. Again, it's the same reasoning for why C is wrong. Both C and D are descriptively accurate of the argument, but it doesn't describe where the argument is vulnerable to criticism. E says, presumes without providing justification that Danto's public relations department would not approve of a draft that was hostile to Danto's food product. It just doesn't presume that. We don't know. All we know is that this draft was approved. It was negative to Ogsonfrey, and this draft was approved. Doesn't mean that if it had not been negative, it wouldn't have been approved. Who knows? So that's the first mistake that E makes. The second mistake is even if this were true, it still doesn't get to the heart of the matter, which is so what? That's just evidence of bias, right? If Danto's Food Public Relations demanded a negative draft before it'll grant its approval, all that says is just evidence for bias, which still doesn't allow you to draw this conclusion. So even if we presume that E is correct, it still doesn't get to the heart of why this premise doesn't support the conclusion, which is what A says. So not only is E descriptively inaccurate, even if we grant E to be descriptively accurate, that is to say, even if the argument does presume this, it still wouldn't be where the argument is flawed.